priests who preyed on more than 1,000 children. Here to discuss the Pennsylvania Attorney General, Josh Shapiro. Attorney General, thank you so much for joining us. I know these are extremely sensitive issues. Let's get to some of the substance right now. After you made that accusation this morning about the Vatican, a Vatican spokesman told CNN, I'll read the quote from the Vatican spokesman, "If the prosecutor is referring to something outside of the report, we'll wait to see that before commenting." So what evidence, Attorney General, do you have that the Vatican knew of a cover-up?
Well, let's be clear, Wolf, and as the chief prosecutor in Pennsylvania, I deal with facts and evidence and apply the law. 23 grand jurors in Pennsylvania sat for 2 years, collecting evidence, listening to testimony, reviewing over 500,000 pages of documents from the church's own secret archives, detailing comprehensive, widespread sexual abuse by predator priests of children, noting 301 predator priests. They also found a systematic cover-up led by senior church officials, people like bishops and now one cardinal. And in many instances, as the grand jury report shows, not a claim from me, but as the grand jury report shows, that cover-up went all the way to the Vatican. The church's own documents that were in the secret archives, presented in the grand jury report, show the connection between the abuse and cover-up in Pennsylvania and the fact that the Vatican was informed of it.
Pretty stunning to think about it. At what point, Attorney General, do these secret archives indicate a cover-up actually started?
Well, we went back decades, roughly 70 years. We found information actually on more than 400 predator priests. But the grand jury wanted to be very, very careful and specific about naming names and making sure that the abuse could be corroborated, that the cover-up could be corroborated. And that was corroborated in a number of ways. Put very basically, it was corroborated in part by people testifying before the grand jury, but it was also corroborated by the church's own documents. Understand something, Wolf. These predator priests raped little children. They abused children. Bishops knew about it and covered it up. They lied to parishioners. They lied to the public. They lied to law enforcement. And then they wrote it all down. They documented all the facts. And oftentimes, they shared those documents that were in the secret archives with the Vatican. So for the representative of the Vatican to say somehow this is new information, I would just say to him, and to all people in Pennsylvania and across the United States, read the report. The details are all contained in that. And I thank the 23 men and women of the Pennsylvania grand jury for listening to this gut-wrenching testimony over a 2-year period of time and coming up with the most comprehensive report on clergy sex abuse in the history of this country.
Do you have evidence, Attorney General, that Pope Francis was aware of this?
I have evidence that the Vatican was aware of it. Once the Vatican learned of it, I do not know whether the Pope learned about it or not. And as a prosecutor dealing with facts and evidence, I'm not going to make a statement, nor am I going to attribute something to the grand jury that is not in the grand jury report. We're going to stick with the facts and the evidence. As to what the Vatican, who in the Vatican knew it, what the Pope knew, that's an answer that only they can provide.
As you know, Missouri is now the second state to go ahead with an investigation along the lines of what you're doing in Pennsylvania. Are you cooperating with them? Is there more state? Do you expect more states to follow your lead?
Wolf, I've received calls from over a dozen attorneys general across this country, along with a senior representative of the Department of Justice, our federal government partners. Some have already begun investigations. At least one that you cited has been open about that. Others are contemplating investigations. And certainly if Pennsylvania can provide any support to them, we will. Look, I think Pennsylvania is a pretty special and unique place. But sadly, I don't think we are unique when it comes to this. I certainly don't have any evidence of it happening in other states. What I do have evidence of, though, is these predator priests were passed around to other states and shielded from law enforcement in the process. Understand, Wolf, this cover-up served a very specific purpose. It was not only to cover it up within the parishes, within the churches, but it was also to shield them from law enforcement. So law enforcement officials like me couldn't charge them with crimes. You know, we uncovered 301 predator priests as part of this grand jury investigation. Sadly, because of our weak laws in Pennsylvania and our limited statute of limitations, I could only charge 2 of them. One of those predator priests has already pled guilty. The other one will be in court later this fall. So we've got to hold these individuals accountable. And if other states are going to step up and try and do that work, the federal government step up and maybe do that work, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, yesterday I interviewed Josh Hawley, the Attorney General of Missouri. He says he was going to move quickly on this area as well. Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Wolf.
All right, up next, there's more news. We're following a major setback with North Korea. This time, a secret letter delivered to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, with a very strong warning for the United States. Plus, a rare reversal for President Trump. What was behind his decision to finally... Diplomats have struggled to advance denuclearization talks. The latest setback came in the form of a letter delivered to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Sources tell CNN that it warned Pompeo that talks may fall apart because the Kim Jong-un regime feels the U.S. is not making progress on replacing the armistice agreement that ended the Korean War with a full-scale peace treaty. It added that if talks fail, North Korea could resume nuclear and missile activities. Shortly after the letter was shown to President Trump, he canceled the secretary's scheduled trip to Pyongyang that had been scheduled for this week. Let's talk about this and more with William Cohen, the former defense secretary under President Bill Clinton. Mr. Secretary, thanks very much for coming in.
Good to be with you,
What's your take on this letter?
Well, it confirms what I thought months ago, that it was a mistake to have had that meeting in Singapore. What the president did was to turn the pyramid of diplomacy on its head. Normally, you would have Secretary Pompeo and others do all of the legwork necessary, building all the blocks in terms of defining what we were after, the steps that would be necessary to confirm, et cetera, and then have the top man come in and say, now we can have an agreement. And so he did it completely in reverse, and as a result now, we're back to square one. So resumption of the military exercises, which again I thought was a mistake to cancel. But one of the problems we're having now is that the South Korean president may decide to go forward on his own without us. It would be a big mistake on his part. To separate South Korea from the United States would put South Korea in jeopardy, as well as our forces there. So it's going to be hard to put everything back home. You can't go home again quite the same. You can't get the Chinese to commit as they have been in the past. You probably won't get the Russians to do the same. So I think we're seeing why it's important to follow the rules that have been established over time.
And listen to the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, today, speaking about those suspended U.S.-South Korean military exercises, which, of course, the North Koreans hate. Listen to this.
We have no plans at this time to suspend any more exercises. We suspended several exercises at the direction of the president. The good faith effort was made. We have done no planning for suspending others. Obviously, we know what exercises are out there, so we could do that if directed to. But right now, there are no plans to go further.
You know what's going to happen, though, when the U.S. and South Korea resume full-scale military exercises, which over the years the North Koreans have always complained about and always have taken action. They presumably will resume their nuclear testing, their ballistic missile testing, which they have suspended at least over these past several months.
We were at a flexion point when we were marshaling our forces there. The rhetoric was high as the president continued to escalate it rhetorically. We had the Chinese on board, we had the Russians on board, we had the Japanese on board, and then we had the meeting in Singapore with a handshake without anything concrete to talk about, to sign. And so as a result, now we're back on our heels. And it's going to be very difficult to put all the pieces together in a way that can bring maximum pressure against the North Koreans. I don't think that any of those in the region are anxious to have the United States go to war with the North Koreans, nor should we be. But I think we were at a point where we had maximum leverage, and I think we gave that up. And now we're going to try to regain it.
Very quickly on your friend John McCain, I know you're going to be a pallbearer Saturday at the memorial service at the National Cathedral here in Washington. Give us a thought or two about this extraordinary man.
Well, what was most remarkable about John was his absolute passion. His passion, his patriotism, his desire for the United States to continue to exercise leadership throughout the world. You know, it's really kind of ironic that here's a man who was beaten so badly, he could never lift his arms up to comb his hair. And yet he was able, through the sheer strength of his personality, to lift up the hopes of millions of people who are under the heel and boot of tyranny and oppression and totalitarianism and authoritarianism, lift them up by giving them hope. So here's a unique individual. Yes, was he flawed? Absolutely. But what's unique about John is he always recognized that when he made a mistake, he had to correct it. And his conscience would not allow him to say something that he knew in his heart was not right without going back and telling the people, not just private.
You know, it is likely we may even hear the word Russia, because these were pro-Russia.